Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Have you ever noticed that when somebody else yawns, that you tend to yawn? Of course you do. We all we joke about it. We see it. My dog yawns, I want to yawn. Well, why is that? It's the term for it, so the actual phenomenon is known as contagious yawning. And it's been talked about, it's been studied, and in humans, what they theorize is that yawning is socially modulated, a socially modulated response. In other words, we yawn because we want to sort of get in with the cluster of people that we're around. So stop and think about it. You're hanging out with people, you just kind of want to get along, and so when somebody yawns, you're like, okay, I guess I need to yawn. It's similar in nature to, and I've noticed this when I have talked to people. I noticed this about myself, I noticed it about others. I've noticed it when I've been in interviews, that if I cross my arms or I cross my legs or do something, other people will do it as well. Or I might mimic them, depending upon the power balance. And again, it just kind of gets into the whole notion of us really just, we're social beings. We kind of want to get along. You know, this person I'm interviewing with, I want to get a job. I want to get along. I want to, what do we have in common? It can be lots of different things. You're drinking coffee, I'll drink coffee. You're folding your arms, I'll fold my arms. You're smiling, I'll smile. And so we're kind of connected in this way. Well, it's a similar story with respect to giving and generosity. And they've actually done studies on this. I've done a podcast on this. I've done an episode on this where I talk about the Liberty Mutual car insurance commercial. And Liberty Mutual insurance commercials will show someone doing a kind act and someone seeing that kind act, and then that someone seeing the kind act will then do their own kind act, which daisy chains to another person watching that kind act, which daisy chains to another, and then ultimately makes it full circle. And we think, oh, that's really neat that, one person's kindness can inspire somebody else's kindness. And you know what? It's true. They've shown it. There's a couple researchers out there that actually wrote a book called Connected, and that's where I saw this, and I did an episode on this. It's James Fowler and Nicholas Christakis, and they did a study. This was back in 2010, so it's somewhat dated. And again, I did an episode on this. But in that particular study, what they did was they brought people into a role-playing game where people played games, and I think they were in groups of 4, and it was kind of a business game where you could win or lose. You had so much money, and you could win or lose, and you could also give money to other participants. So if somebody did something for you, you could give them money. And the early iterations of the game, because what they would do is they would play a game, there'd be a group of 4, they would play a game, and then you would go to a new group of 4. They had lots of people. And so there was just kind of all this just intermingling and playing the game. And some people were winners and some people were losers, and it was just kind of going along just fine. But they had people in the game we'll call them Confederates, or they are called Confederates. They're in on the research. You think they're just another participant in this game, but they're really, wink, wink, in on the research. And at one point in time, what ended up happening was these Confederates just gave some money. It may have just been one person. Bob, I know you lost money on that one, but I really appreciated your tactics. So I'm going to give you some of my money. Not all of my money, but just a little bit of my money. And people in the game, they saw that. Oh, that's kind of neat. And what Fowler and Christakis found was that that one thing was sort of a multiplier or a tipping point or the impetus for getting other people to give. So as the games went on, you're sitting around and one person does a kind act, and there's certainly a person who's the beneficiary of that kind act, and there's two other people who witnessed the kind act. Well, you go to the next iteration of the game, and those three people, not the Confederate, but those three people saw the kind act, and they were more likely to do something kind. The tone had been set. You know what? You can do something nice for somebody else. So they would be in their new groups of four, and they might do a kind act. And this generosity became contagious. Likely not with everybody, but it became contagious compared to when early on when nobody was doing anything but just playing the game, and there were winners and there were losers. And it shows that generosity is totally contagious. We're all inspired by the people around us. And so again, I did an episode on this. I've been trying to find it. Again, I'm almost at 600 episodes. There's a lot of episodes there. But I found some follow-up research on this, and what they actually did was Christakis and Fowler are social scientists. Christakis is a medical doctor as well, but he's really got into the social sciences. But neuroscience has kind of gotten involved with this. And what they did was they started looking at what happens, what's causing this. It's nice to see it in action, but it's also nice to know what causes things. There's a saying out there, saying I learned in high school biology back in the 10th or 11th grade, but as the island of knowledge grows, so does the shoreline of curiosity. Meaning the more we know, the more we want to know. We just keep wanting to know more and more. And so neuroscience is like, okay, well, why is this? Why does somebody have a greater proclivity to give to somebody else when they witness these acts of kindness, random acts of kindness or planned acts of kindness or whatever it is? Why is it happening? So what they did was they started looking at brain scans. They looked at brain scans to see what was going on in people's minds when they were witnessing these acts of kindness. So they brought people in, they hooked them up, all sorts of wires to their head. You can imagine that. And then they started showing them videos showing heroic acts of kindness. And what they found was that areas of the brain, the areas of the brain that were aroused or triggered, if you will, aroused is the term they used in the study, were those areas of the brain that were involved in social engagement. So they were, so essentially what's happening, and I'm not a neuroscience, so somebody can challenge me on this, but my understanding is essentially what's happening is it's basically nudging people. It's basically saying, okay, you need to do this. You've seen this. It just kind of pushes somebody to the edge of doing something nice, and we see this all the time out there. Like in fundraisers, you'll have people who will like be at a silent auction. You have somebody going around and they'll write things in on each one of the things. Maybe not one person, but several people bidding on things. Well, that's getting other people to kind of bid. Auctioneers, I know a couple auctioneers, and they will do a similar sort of thing. Get somebody to kind of kick it off. Listen, you may or may not want this trip to Aruba, but go ahead and put a bid on it because your bid will likely spur other people to bid. You see it with respect to tip jars. Seldom does somebody put a tip jar out that's empty, because if there's a tip jar out there and it's empty, then there's an indication that nobody's ever given a tip. But if you put a few dollars in there, if you put just coinage in there, just coinage will show up. But if you put a few dollars in there, put a $5 in there, $5 bill in there, then it kind of nudges people. They're not seeing the act of kindness, but they presume that it was an act of kindness that made this happen. And so, you're more likely to put money in there if there's this, if the money's already there, if there's already an implication that somebody has committed an act of kindness, have given a tip. So we see these sorts of things. You hear the stories about the McDonald's drive-through or the Tim Hortons or wherever, wherever you get your coffee. A lot of people don't have Tim Hortons necessarily. But you know what I'm saying? If somebody goes through the McDonald's and listen, I'm going to pay for the person behind me, and then when the person behind comes up and says, listen, that person ahead of you, they paid for you. Well, then I'm going to pay for the person behind me. And it's kind of this daisy chain of people accepting these good deeds. It's all this, it's the brain kind of being triggered, the part of the brain that's involved in social engagements activated, much like when we yawn. When somebody yawns and we see that social part of our brain is activated, and it's like, okay, I just want to fit in. And so I'm going to yawn too. We're supposed to be tired. When somebody does it, you might yell at them to stop yawning. I don't want to yawn. That's not the game I want to play. I don't want to be tired right now. But the point behind this episode and point behind sharing this additional work in the area is that you do have control over what's going on around you. If you want a more generous network, if you want a network that's predisposed to helping other people, you can seed that activity. You can simply seed that activity by being the person who's doing things. And I'm not saying you need to put money in the tip jar necessarily, or you need to be out of pocket. There are a lot of things that we can do that can help other people. Making introductions, for example, sharing information. Those things don't cost money, but when people see those sorts of things, they're inspired to do those things as well. And so what I advocate, if you want to try and create more giving in your network, is to be the person who is doing the giving, to start out. And I'm not advocating you go broke doing this, but I'm advocating you find ways to help the people in your network and allow other people to see that, because when they see that, they will be much more likely to give to other people. And eventually that giving, much like the Liberty Mutual Insurance car commercial, where it kind of daisy chains back all the way back to the person who set it in motion, that's you. That's you. You essentially become the architect of the good things that you get in life.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.